Stephen Waterhouse, co-founder of Nazare. How are you doing?
I'm good. Nice to
Good.
see you, Peter.
And you go by Seven.
To my friends, but
To
you can do that.
okay. I remember back in 2017 we talked about this a second ago, but we were at a I led growth for another company at the time, and we were at an ETH San Francisco event. And I remember when I first met you, you introduced yourself as Seven, so I
Yeah,
figured I could call you the Seven.
you can call me seven. You met me once, twice, so it's good. Yeah,
Perfect.
as I do more work in venture and talk to LP potentials and wear like slightly better clothes or well more dress up a bit, then I tend to introduce myself as Stephen. But yeah,
That
my partner
sounds
calls me
good.
Seven, and my team calls me Seven, so yeah, mostly
Okay.
Seven.
Well, you've been in this space for quite a while. Some might even call you an OG. So I want to do a quick intro, really quick, and then would love to hear your thoughts on a couple of things.
Sure.
Okay, so you started your PhD in neural networks, I understand, from Cambridge, and then you went to NASA, and then you founded Orchid Labs with a pretty amazing team, and that's when we met back in 2017, 2018, something like that. And now you're leading Nazare Ventures. Um, and want to definitely hear your hot takes on the industry, AI and crypto, and what you're up to at Nazare. Maybe if you could begin with sharing with us kind of like what motivated your kind of the transitions from being very focused on crypto generally, and then privacy with Orchid, and then now your thoughts around AI and starting a venture firm focused on I believe the primary thesis is investing in AI projects. Is that correct?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Take
So,
us through your transitions.
yeah, build transitions. I've been in and out of venture since the early 2000s. I was a entrepreneur in residence at Foundation Capital in the early 2000s before I ended up starting an IP company and taking that public. Um, and then again, of course, with Pantera Capital, got back into the venture game there. Um, then stepped away from it in 2017 to start Orchid. Um, Stepped back in 2021, and I helped my friend Richard Muirhead with Fabric Ventures as an advisor and venture partner there. And then again with Nazare, and in between, I've been angel investing and doing some interesting deals. I was the first check in Risk Zero, the first check in Squid Router, so I've been successful with some angel things. I wanted to keep doing angel investing, essentially like the feel of angel investing, meaning to me that means I want to work with founders. I want to, to the extent they'll let me, like help them build, help them construct their companies, raise their rounds, like build something huge. And the fund gives me a platform to do that at scale in a way that you have to fight hard to do that as an angel investor. So that was the sort of idea of building Nazare. As far as like the direction, I kind of turn it back on AI as I used it in a number of companies along the way, but like at RPX, the IP company, I was building models of patent risk and trying to value patents in order to we bought patents to stop patent trolls from buying patents. Basically, we were the good guys in the marketplace. And but I'd mostly turn my back on a lot of AI because in the early 2000s, what I realized that most of AI was going to end up being used for quite a while to just mine humans, to do e-commerce, advertising, kind of build an understanding, the kind of the dark dystopian side of surveillance capitalism, right? And Orchid was the foil of that. It was like, can we build something that gives you censorship resistance, is free from surveillance, gives you the ability to step out of that equation. So obviously, I was quite, like opposed to that kind of model. But AI wasn't just like any tool. AI wasn't the culprit there. It was the use of it. What I saw in the early days of tools like Stability AI, then of course the early ChatGPT was that suddenly this was an enabling technology. It was a human enhancing technology, not a human mining technology. And with all of the concerns people have around big AI and all these kind of things, these tools are still useful. They're still like enhancing our ability to do things, our ability to be productive, to solve problems that we have. And that was fascinating to me. Now, I knew pretty early on that I wanted to do something in that space. And the thing that really caught my imagination was not so much the applications, although I love many of the applications. I'm definitely a power user. And not so much the hardware, because I like hardware, but I don't have a hardware angle in my investing, or a background there. But it was really this idea of looking at the software infrastructure and looking at the opportunity space that was being created there. Now, the thing that it struck me was very similar to different pivot periods in after the dot-com bust and also after the Great Financial Crisis. You saw this move initially from very large, kind of big servers at the end of the dot-com. Like you had to have a Sun machine or a Hewlett Packard machine in order to even get funded. I was like, "Where's your contract with Sun? Where's your contract with Oracle?" And then within a year or two, that had moved, or a couple of years, had moved to fully distributed server setups that Google was using and then Amazon was using and so on, like this much larger distributed setup. But that technology to do that was all software. Like there was hardware, but it was very simple hardware. A similar thing happened at the end of 2008, that period when people shifted from having their own server farms to just putting everything on the cloud. And so I saw this opportunity of like, well, Nvidia is building this big iron. It feels a lot like the Sun systems that I was working on back in the early 2000s. What if there's a pivot, a change to a more distributed and perhaps a decentralized form of AI compute? And so our thesis is we look at the software that allows you to build and operate AI systems on the continuum from the biggest clusters, mega clusters, all the way through to the edge devices, like with everything in between.
Now, maybe we can back up a bit, just for the
So,
audience. So when we think of AI, most people are familiar with the application of ChatGPT, Grok, etc., right?
yeah,
But if we go backwards, maybe walk us through like what are the major steps to get to the application layer, so that at the consumer level, so that people have used the phrase, algorithmic development, there's model development, data labeling, etc. Maybe
sure.
walk us through, and
So how
then
it looks.
and
Yeah,
then given the AI stack, where are you specifically focused on, and how does crypto play into that, if at all?
sure. Okay, a little walkthrough of AI. So what we call AI today is primarily, almost universally, neural networks, which is a field that dates back to the 50s. But I'm not going to give you the full history story here, although it is interesting. Um, there's a great book called The Alignment Problem, which deals very little with the actual alignment problem, but gives a very good overview of an historical analysis. So if your readers, listeners, sorry, are looking for something interesting to read, that's a good one. Essentially, these systems, they learn from data, and so you need a whole bunch of data. You need a model with what we call weights, which is essentially the sort of variables that are learnt as it sees the data. And then once the model is built, you show it new data and it does some kind of prediction. So in the case of, say, like image classification, which is a common thing that we do in AI, we'd say, okay, here's a bunch of pictures of cats, here's a bunch of pictures of dogs. Now I showed a picture of a cat. What is this? Is it a cat or is it a dog? And if it's a Shiba, it's not quite sure, it gets confused. So that was sort of the way AI worked for a very long time. And in order to do that, and still does, and the way to do that at scale in image labeling That's what we're talking with data labeling. So we need, first of all, usually a data set which is human labeled. So back in 2016, this was done using data labeling with Mechanical Turk on Amazon. And now that's done with a combination of machine and then human labeling. What you're using most of the time are one of two things in the chatbots and sort of like the chat GPT and so on. You're either using an image model, which is say generate this thing, right? Or you're using something you're just talking to and is giving you some kind of text output. Now, the text output and also to some extent the image ones use a technology which is called a transformer. Now, this transformer was a new invention a few years ago. It came out of Google, and it had a very unique approach to the network structure. It used a recurrent network, which means you wrap some of the outputs into the inputs, but then it had a special kind of what they call attention, which is like paid attention to certain parts of the previous inputs. And the fun thing about this, because it's recurrent, is that you can just take text and just feed it into it. And so the entire internet becomes the training set. You don't need to label anything. You just kind of just like throw it through. So the tricky thing that's happening with a transformer, especially on text, is all it's doing is predicting what the next best word is. And so, I catch myself trying to remember that when I'm using it and thinking that this thing is like, even with my experience, I'm like, this thing feels so real. But all it's really doing is predicting the next word. And and Sam Altman and Ilya and some of the others talk about this, and they say, well, maybe that's all intelligence is knowing what to say next. And the new transformers have other tweaks, and the reasoning models, the ones that are a bit slower, which we saw initially with DeepSeek, but O3 from ChatGPT and others have these characteristics. They're basically wrapping around the output. So they're doing something and then they're telling it again to think again. It's basically thinking for longer. That's a rough, simple version on AI as it is today. What we're seeing more and more is just bigger and bigger models. There's a concept that we're sort of running out of data, but now what we're doing is using the data that we have and the models that we have to create what's called reasoning data, which is synthetic. Essentially, it's like asking the model to solve a series of problems and then using those as training sets for the next model that is built from that. So we're kind of using models to build themselves.
Yeah.
That's the state of the art.
I'm glad you walked us through kind of the history. So in grad school, I studied computational linguistics. This was
cool.
This was a while ago, right?
Yeah, sure.
And my thesis was on something called word sense disambiguation, and
Yep.
I created a program, a neural net in Perl. Can you believe that? I mean, people used Perl back then, and one example of this, just for the audience, is the word bank. Could have different senses. So bank is in like the financial institution, or bank the side of a river, or bank when you shoot a basketball and you bank it off the side, right? And so how can a machine or how can a program know like in what sense are you using the word bank? And so I created this neural net using, at the time, it was pretty novel research called analogical model of reasoning. And the predictability of this program was pretty high at the time. This was back in a while ago. I don't want to age myself, but I'm pretty old.
Yeah, sure.
So
was this pre-embeddings or post-embeddings?
No, this was pre-embedding.
Yeah.
So I went to school in Chicago and studied under a guy named John Goldsmith, who's kind of a big deal in the computational linguistics space, or really linguistics at the time. Computational linguistics was just kind of becoming vogue, I guess. And computer scientists were interested, etc. And so, but anyway, it's really interesting to see what's happening now, because now we have like all this data that's available to be trained on. A lot of it has been labeled, so the data makes sense. But what I'm noticing still is that the problem of word sense disambiguation like still exists. And so we
Mm.
still haven't solved some of the most basic things, such as, a machine can't really tell irony, for example, or sarcasm. And so if we were to apply the Turing test, like it's you can still tell if it's a human or a machine. And so despite all the advancements that we've made, we're still there's still some
Yeah.
very basic human things that a machine cannot do.
It's like the Turing test is a spectrum now. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah. No, you're right. You're exactly right. But
it's
there
almost
are
like
some cases.
if you think you're talking to the machine, then you'll start like doing different things.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, there are cases where I'm using, Grok or ChatGPT, and especially with deep research, when you click on the
mhm.
deep research
Oh yeah,
button, it's like, wow, it's
yeah.
reasoning,
It's
thinking.
remarkable. Yeah, it's
It
really
really
remarkable.
is. Now,
Um,
tell us what is your thesis around, having been in the crypto space as an investor and as a founder, an operator, and now you're focused on the um, AI kind of a segment, I guess. I don't even know
the
if
wave.
that's the right word. Yeah, AI wave. But you don't quite see it as being completely separate. There's some
Mm.
relationship there. And so tell us your thesis around AI plus crypto. And
Yeah,
yeah, tell us that.
I scratched my head for a long time and I'd had sleepless nights trying to find the answer to this question where people would say to me, "What is the intersection?" I was into AI crypto and I was like, and I got asked this question so many times that in the end I was like, yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know what the intersection is exactly. I know these are two very powerful technologies, and I think there are ways that they can be used in combination. But I have a very extreme and almost kind of stark view on crypto today, which is I think there are two product market fit happening, one of them more obvious than the other. The first one is just finance. Crypto is becoming finance. TradFi is becoming DeFi, is becoming TradFi. It's just like a merger. And we've seen that in everything from ETFs all the way through to JP Morgan using Uniswap tech and everything in between. So we'll see like real world assets, we'll see all these things, stable coins. It's just like a big thing. And now that regulatory environment has swung more positive, I think we'll just see a big race towards, following that product market fit. And that's very refreshing in crypto when you've been struggling to find product market fit with many applications over the years. We have a little bit of product market fit and then it just kind of pulls back. And so we've had this thing where we've been trying to get crypto products into people's hands, but stablecoins just work. So I say, if you're in crypto, pivot to stablecoins. Secondly, if you're in crypto, pivot to AI. And I don't mean crypto AI, I mean actually AI. So one of the things I work on with my companies and my investments that have crypto as part of the product set is be an AI company. Service people in the AI business, service people who have needs. Find your products, find your customers. And this is often quite foreign concept to many crypto founders who've been trained in the last, I'll say 5 years or so, where the primary thing in crypto is that the token is a product. And so you build a company and your concept is like, how can I get as complicated and as nuanced with my technology and then get my marketing really good, get my KOLs in there and I got a token, that's the product. And I'm like, no, if you're really lucky, you'll make bank on that kind of thing, back to your bank. But quite likely you'll miss the timing. And then you'd end up with this thing, which is like actually kind of a weight around your neck. And you're like, well, what the hell am I doing? I don't really have a product and I've got all this liability to deal with, all these users, all these kind of not users, but traders. I'm saying, like, let's go back to the old days. Let's find products that have product market fit. Let's find customers. Let's focus on problems. And to the extent that crypto is helpful and beneficial in those situations, let's use it. But I'm trying to build AI companies, and some of them have crypto rails, some of them have crypto backends, but I'm certainly not investing in some intersection. That's like I'm not investing in a meme. So there's in our portfolio there are things that are much more like very decentralized, almost kind of crypto native. For example, Imad from Stability AI's new company called Intelligent Internet. That one is a fully decentralized AI computes, models, data, So like AI for the people. Um, but then at the other extreme, I have one of my investments, the earliest investments, is called Vast AI, which is a decentralized GPU platform without crypto. So you bring your GPU, you rent it out, you get paid on Stripe, good old settlement, and they do the sort of auditing of and build a reputation model and so on. It's like an Airbnb or a clearinghouse for the GPUs.
Mm.
Probably could ask crypto at some point, but that's just not the thing. And they make a lot of money doing that and service the AI market really well. We've also seen really interesting things where there's almost like a hybrid of these two. So you've got Layer Lens, which is building benchmarking services for companies with building AI. So if you've got like a Tesla or an Anthropic or something building new models, how do they know and how do they have an independent verifier of how good their model is on certain tasks? And so what Layer Lens does is build benchmarks. They use the existing benchmarks and then publish that information, either privately or publicly. And the way that they get their compute is they use an eigenlayer powered GPU cloud. So they have like a token there which people bring the GPUs and work that way. So you see how you can kind of hybridize these things together, but you try and find the situations where there's a product market fit. And we've had companies where we've invested in them thinking they were going to do a token, and then they pivoted back. And other companies where we've invested and they're like, well, actually, we think we might add a token. And we're like, we didn't expect it to, but sure, if you need some help doing that, we're here to help.
Yeah, yeah.
So the basic thesis, the basic thesis is we're looking at decentralized and open source AI is one of the sort of fundamental things we're looking at. And obviously, in the case of decentralized, we may have crypto exposure in those situations.
So it maybe another way to think of it is rather than the intersection, it's you approach your investments with the AI lens first, and to the extent that decentralization and crypto as an incentive mechanism makes sense, then that becomes part of it. But it's AI first.
Yeah,
Is that a decent characterization of what you said?
that's definitely it. Yeah.
Okay, and
Um,
and I agree
and
with
so
that.
for example,
Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
we're also like we're not heavily focusing on like the kind of the finance side of AI either. Like some people are looking very much at DeFi and trading bots and all these things, and I think these things are interesting. I just think that I think there's so much opportunity within just the sort of the raw infrastructure opportunity within AI that we think we can like really focus on that and do well. And we think it's very fascinating too.
The when you say raw infrastructure, tell us about. I guess what are the opportunities right now? And I agree with you. I think there's a lot of crypto people that are looking at agents and how to make more money using AI, et cetera. But I think enterprises have a different view. I believe they're looking at how can AI help us save money,
Mhm.
save money, and save time. I'm not sure if we're at the stage yet of enterprises looking at how can we generate more revenue. Is that your experience, and maybe how do you view kind of AI adoption in the enterprise space?
Yeah, so on the agent side, it's very interesting. I started looking at agents, I don't know, like 2 years ago or so, but it was pre the sort of crypto agents. It was before the infinite backrooms and all of that kind of fun stuff with virtuals. Um, and the area I was looking at was in cooperative agent architectures and looking at that in the enterprise space. And I think if you look at the SaaS business model and try to understand that, an example of this is if you were to build your own CRM today, what would that look like? And most likely it would look like a database, which you would structure in some way so that there's sort of nuances and knowledge embedded into it. Maybe you'd process it in some way, connect it to a mail server, have some kind of interactive component that you can update things on, and then a language model. And so a lot of the kind of kind of grift that goes on with something like a Salesforce, where they sell you this thing which is kind of brittle but very powerful. But in order to make it work, you need all their extra consultants and then someone else and the add-ons, and you got to tune it and work it through so on and forth. You just want to talk to the data. And that's what an LLM gives you. So you start thinking about a lot of SaaS businesses, and you can just flip them all around and say, let's have a data source and a model and an interface. And so I think a lot of SaaS will get replaced by agents on the enterprise side. Now, as far as like, I think that the test with AI will come as sort of how much it's disrupting the workforce when we see a crop of graduates come out of the best schools and not get jobs in consulting firms because the consulting firms are like, we're good. Or they get the jobs because they know how to use AI, and then a middle tier just gets eliminated or just doesn't get promoted because the consulting firms are very much up and out, right? So they just get out. They don't even have to fire them. They just kind of listen, you're not going to make a partner. See you guys later. You're out. We're seeing it already in our investments where we see, and this is to your point as to saving money. We see it where AI companies, AI software development companies we're investing in don't hire at the rate that we expect them to. And when we talk to them about it, they're like, well, we're just using more AI, and so we're spending more time to figure out how to use it to help us do what we're doing, whether that's writing code or operating systems. So I think that there will be a fairly swift, not even necessarily reduction in team size, but just like a slowdown in hiring, which will be the same thing eventually. How that happens in the larger companies, we will see. But yeah, I think that these companies that we're looking at that are adopting AI, they will certainly become more profitable. Whether that leads to increasing revenue, we'll see. I don't know. It's depends on the space. The problem with finance, I find, and people saying I'm going to use this AI model to make me trade better or lead to better results and so on, is that you're getting into the hedge fund world, right? You're getting into like competing with the Two Sigmas and these people who have insane resources and models. And I'd love it if we built some kind of decentralized open source version of that, but that's kind of a whole game, a whole nother world. I've never really been into financial trading for financial trading's sake. I'm much more of a product builder. I want to build things that are not in that space, doing different things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity in that, not in the intersection, but as you said, AI first and then crypto second.
Yeah, and I think the AI first product development approach is very interesting, and I think forces you down a path of how can we make this actually useful, which is kind of the criticism against AI is that it's going to replace humans, right? But it's actually going to make humans more effective in what they do and allow them to focus on things that probably bring them more joy, probably bring them more satisfaction. I back to the agent space. I met with a project last week that's creating they're in the agent kind of swarm space, and so we talked about what swarms are, and apparently these agents. One of the big problems with AI right now is that it learns on static data for the most part, and then on the prediction space, like you described earlier, like predicts the next word, but it's based on a set corpus or of data that's kind of it's already existing. But what about data that's created as the machine thinks? And so we talked about that in this conversation that I had with this team, and they're trying to create a situation infrastructure that allows agents, as it's thinking, it's creating data at the same time, and it's making decisions off that current reasoning, but that needs to be stored somewhere. And so that's one of the big problems with really replicating humans is as we're doing something, like for example, right now I'm kind of talking out loud. That's not captured anywhere. As I'm working in the garden, like all of my thoughts are in my thoughts, like it's in my mind, and so it needs to that kind of information needs to end up somewhere in order for machines to learn from that. And so that was the conversation that we had, and how that's actually a really hard problem. And the conversation also went to like maybe all the data that's currently available on the internet's like it's been exhausted, and so what the next step then is like of the data that's really messy, like it needs to be labeled, and so there's a lot of opportunities in the labeling space. But also there really it's like how do we get all of the thinking, the thoughts, the reasoning that it doesn't appear anywhere, how do we get that out so that these machines and these models can learn um, from that type of information that doesn't exist? Anyway, what are your thoughts on that? Because that's a very compelling problem, I think.
I think that the I think the concern over lack of data is it's valid, but there's also nuances. So synthetic data is not the terrible thing that people have blown it out to be. It turns out that you can build synthetic data sets that are very effective, especially for chain of thought reasoning. Some of what you're describing is a little bit like what is the human chain of thought when you're solving problems or ruminating on things, I guess. I mean, short of putting a wire in your head, I don't really get access to your thoughts, but I guess you could verbalize things, and that would be an interesting training data set. And some people look at that kind of thing of like, how do you, some companies looking at how to incentivize a collection of different training data. I don't know. I think also we'll see the emergence of not necessarily like the biggest model you can think of that has all the data in all the world, because you can't get all the data in all the world because a lot of data is private. So maybe what you see instead is the emergence of models that I guess sort of act like agents. I mean, they're like you just ask them for their opinion, but maybe you have to pay for it. So you have to pay extra. So like if you've got a subscription to the Bloomberg agent, you can talk to it. You can get that data out of it. But it doesn't expose all of its data all the time. And it's building data and context all the time. So I can imagine there's like stitching together lots of different agents and then using other models to judge those outputs and form them into a cohesive whole without having to have a single model built on all data everywhere, right? So you kind of like just imagine these mixtures built together. I think
Do you
that's a
see
reasonable.
that in that situation? Do you see crypto as an incentive mechanism, maybe as a payment rail, would make sense?
Well, there are sort of two outcomes here where either everybody's on the same rails, right? So that works too. Just everyone's on Stripe, for example. Now, where wouldn't that work? Well, it wouldn't work where you can't get Stripe, right? It wouldn't work where you have different models which are in geographic regions where you don't have the same kind of payment architecture. It's kind of messy to use the same kind of payment architecture. And I think then you'll start to see crypto getting used. As far as incentive mechanisms, I don't know. I think it's application dependent. I think that there's like a kind of competing force here happening, which is that I think that crypto rails will just get used all over the place. I think they're a much easier mechanism for programming and for utility and for implementation. I think we should that the thing we just talked about probably should just use stable coins anyway. Because existing banking rails suck, right? So like just use the crypto ones, but not because it necessarily needs to have crypto rails, but just because they're better. I think is the way I look at it. Because again, once you start thinking about it, you try and like force yourself into this the same as the intersection question, where you're just like, am I just forcing crypto onto this because I think it's cool, or is it really the right thing? So that's why often I start these things out by just saying, well, if we all use the same rails, we could use Stripe, but that doesn't always work. So there'll be situations where that doesn't make sense. So identify the situations where that doesn't make sense, because that's going to be the default. Like, you just program the thing you know how to use. And yeah, it's a bit more expensive, or maybe it's not. And yeah, it doesn't work sometimes, and it's kind of annoying, but you know what? It just works most of the time. So you just use the thing that works.
How do you stop yourself from? I mean, you've been in the crypto space for a long time. How do you stop yourself from thinking, "Am I forcing crypto onto this thing that doesn't even need it?" Like, how do you, I guess, help like reflect in a way that's honest and makes you really answer the question like sincerely and whether or not the product actually needs crypto? Do you often find yourself thinking like that?
Um, yeah, so I have a simple way of looking at most crypto, which is it's a way to route around centralized points of control. So that's kind of what it was developed for in Bitcoin, right? And so what I look at something, I'm like, okay, what's the centralized point of control I'm trying to route around, right? What's going on here? So you look at decentralized GPUs, whether it's using crypto or not, I'm routing around Nvidia. I'm routing around CUDA, right? That's the centralized point of control. Why? Because, it's expensive. It's kind of like a lock-in. Maybe we can do something different. Maybe we can build software that like allows us to have decentralized GPUs, not just all centralized. That might be a more interesting world. Have more open source systems. This could be like a bigger playground for developers. That would be interesting, right? My friend Eric Voorhees, he built Venice, which has got lots of open source language models in there. What's the centralized point of control he's going after? He doesn't want censorship. He wants to be able to ask the Venice system anything and for it to give it, what he calls an uncensored answer. Now, whether it's, one person's bias is someone else's censorship. So like we kind of, what exactly is not biased and not censored. But the point is, at least at least you can go back and use the model and say, I know this thing like Hermes from Noose, or, whichever model, the dolphin model has come out. I know where that came from. I know where the answer's coming from. With Bitcoin, we're routing around centralized points of control, which are obvious. ICOs, we're routing around people like me, like fun, investors, or forcing us to play in a different game. And so I ask myself that question when I look at something with a crypto as part of the product, is like, what am I routing around? What is the centralized point of control that's being overcome here? And could I build the same thing without crypto? And would it matter?
Mhm.
And would anyone care? Right? So
I think that's a good question that
yeah,
if you force yourself to ask that, especially as an investor and you're helping your founders, helping them reflect on that, it kind of gets you out of your head, especially if you've been steeped in either the crypto or the AI space. If in the AI space, then you can see, crypto could help as a way to get around the centralized structures, focus on decentralization, and really it's very supportive of kind of the agentic kind of mindset. But if in the crypto space, then AI becomes a very different, opportunity where that just gives, I think, founders more breathing room in terms of what's available versus kind of forcing them down a specific path. If we could go back to Nazare and what you're up to there,
sure.
the so the AI infrastructure, kind of AI product focus is kind of top of mind. Tell us what kinds of projects you're interested in evaluating, investing
Yeah.
in, anything that excites you right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've described a few of the things. So we're looking a lot of things around, what I call a continuum of compute. Everything from edge devices through to mega clusters. It's not either or. It's like, what does that continuum look like? How do you build software for it? How do you build AI applications? How do you execute those things? But there's another area which we're very interested in, and I just call this like algorithmic exploration. And you can see some point examples of this already that are very successful. What I'm talking about is stepping outside of the big language models in terms of how they're architected from the algorithm perspective, the model design, and experimenting in that. So one example is Mixtral, which is a Paris-based company, uses a scaling technique called mixes of expert, which I did my PhD in back in the 90s, but that's the whole story. So they use mixes of experts, the scaling tech. And that scaling tech has now been used in many systems. It's used in ChatGPT. It was then used in DeepSeek. DeepSeek developed another algorithmic innovation, which is sort of the chain of thought reasoning approach. And one of the things that happened with DeepSeek is that we've had this kind of catchy theme called matcha, which is make AI cheap again.
Yeah.
And little green hats with matcha. The sort of joke around that is that how did we get to billion-dollar seed rounds? I mean, I know how we got there, but the way we got there is just by like adding more compute, adding more data, and just saying we've just got to go bigger and bigger and bigger to make these things better, which works. But at a certain point, I don't know, someone starts putting tariffs on the world. People say, hang on a second, I don't have the budget I thought I had before. I need to find something cheaper. And then we're back to 2000 or 2008, like I talked about before, and people want to find something cheaper. Now, what happened with DeepSeek, which is super exciting, is that suddenly people in labs all over the world said, hang on a second, I've got a new way to do a transformer. I've got a new way to make that model better. I know how to make it cheaper. Maybe I can get funding. And they call people like me. And so if you've got a new algorithm, I'm interested in talking. We're looking into that space as well. But the theme here is very much like trying to imagine the future software infrastructure that AI models are going to get built on. We don't think it's a winner-take-all environment. We don't think that OpenAI or Anthropic are going to rule the world of models. We think there'll be lots of different approaches here. We also think that open source will continue to be a vibrant area for development. And we want to focus on the software infrastructure that allows these things to flourish.
Yeah. So your article, make AI cheap again. I don't know if you noticed this, but on the CoinDesk webpage, above the fold, so your article's in the middle, and then above the fold there's 3 ads like circling your article, and it's really, I haven't like visited a website like CoinDesk in a while, and so I was surprised to see literally so many ads above the fold. This is totally aside. And then as I scroll, there's 2 more ads under your article. It's crazy.
Lots of ads.
But
got to pay for these words, right?
That's how they got to make some money. But it's an interesting article. If you're in, so the title is "If You're in Crypto, Pivot to AI Now." And maybe let's talk about that. I know we've kind of talked through some threads from the article, but maybe tell us the main thesis of the article and what your message is to crypto people.
Well, I mean, this is a riff. I will give credit. This is a riff to Jason Calacanis, who tweeted this. I think when crypto was crashing, FTX and everything was collapsing, and the AI space was obviously taking off. And it's important to understand that context is that when a lot of the founders and investors in AI were coming up, which was a couple of years ago, we were crashing. It was 3AC. It was FTX as the sort of final blow. But, the whole thing started with Terra Luna. And that was like one of the worst years. And I've been in the space since 2013, and I've been through Silk Road, Mt. Gox, Bitstamp hacks. Like I've been through it all, right? But at that moment, I turned to my partner who's also in crypto, and I was like, I don't know, babe. Like maybe this is it. Now I feel like actually it's going to be okay, and I sort of feel like crypto is going to make it. It's going to be established. It's going to be a thing. I feel like the sort of the babies leaving the house and the teenagers off to college, and I'm also finding that my excitement and the kind of the weird revolutionary characters that I love hanging out with in whatever field I'm working in, they're doing different things. Some of them are still in crypto. Many of my friends still are, and I see the whole gang every time I go to a crypto conference. But the weird new people are going and doing something else. and that thing is AI. And that for me is a bonus. It's also a big attraction to being in a space, is being on that risky, kind of weird bleeding edge of things. I certainly hope that we see some interesting fusion of these two worlds that I love over the next few years. But for me, the focus is going to be, as you said, very much AI first.
Yeah.
As far as pivoting, I mean, it's a tongue-in-cheek thing. The spirit of the article is what I talked about, which is I see us moving into very much like finance or like AI applications. And that doesn't mean that there isn't opportunity, because in the things that people aren't looking at or the things that aren't in vogue, that's often the best places to do something new. And I certainly expect to see, I've been a big collector of NFTs and fascinated by the generative art movement. Many friends in that area. Seth from Bright Moments is a good friend. Kevin Abosh, like I'm deep into that crew, and I think the digital art will continue to and become something that actually surprises people over the next few years. I think that gaming will surprise people, but I think those things will be largely eclipsed by, at least in the short to medium term, the other two opportunities in finance and in AI.
As an aside, since you mentioned NFTs, this project that I talked with last week, their agents are actually NFTs,
Oh, cool.
which gives us some really interesting. These agents
So,
have very interesting properties now of ownership
yeah,
because they are NFTs, which I thought was
that's cool.
I think pretty cool. So Nazare, you're actively investing in projects, and projects can learn more about Nazare at nazare.io, where they could submit their application to be evaluated if they want investment from Nazare. Do you have like a typical check size that you invest in, like what range, or I
Yeah,
guess
so
yeah.
we're usually investing in the earliest phases of a company, in the pre-seed to seed phase, so formation through to kind of first product. We invest between 150 through to 500 or 1 million, depending on the size of the round and the team. Yeah, but we work alongside a lot of other investors, smaller and larger. We play well with others. We tend to be a value add for the deals we do, so
And
we
you
get to see some
typically
interesting
you want to
things.
be the first check, it sounds like.
If we're not the first, then at least in the first round is the best for
Mm.
us. Um,
And in AI infrastructure, and infrastructure, like we've discussed, is a very broad topic.
Sure.
Any specific categories within infrastructure that you are especially focused on right now?
Um, so a good friend of mine told me that the best way to describe a thesis is by what you don't do.
Mm.
So we don't do hardware and we don't do apps. So
Okay,
we kind of do all the squishy stuff in between.
so everything else is fair game.
Yeah. I mean, we are often application driven and application focused in terms of the things we're investing in, because we like to understand what the application is, but we're not sort of particularly doing. In most cases, the customer for us is investments is developers of AI, businesses using AI, not so much consumers in this iteration.
Yeah. Any portfolio companies you want to? Maybe you can highlight one portfolio company that you're particularly excited about.
I mean, there's so many. We've invested in 9 companies over the last year, and our full portfolio is on Nazare.io. I mentioned a few of them already with Vast, Intelligent Internet, and Layer Lens. I mean, probably just the fairest, the most recent one we just invested in is called Fairmouth, which is building a fully homomorphic encryption platform, all open source. it may not be obvious why this is important for decentralized AI, but we think that it will be crucial in the future. And the team is fantastic. So that was the latest one we just did.
That's pretty cool. I've often thought about the intersection of ZK with AI and like where the opportunities are, and which kind of is in your space since you're an advisor to Risk Zero.
Yep.
By the way, I'm interviewing Rika, who is on the Risk Zero team
Oh, great.
on the boundless side,
On the
and
boundless team, yeah, the new
yeah,
name, yeah. Yeah, it's a
um,
great team. We've done a number of deals in ZK. Hellas is another deal we did in the ZK space, focusing on proving whether or not a particular AI model was executed. They have a platform for doing that. And then I've been doing ZK all the way back to Zcash. I was the
yeah,
Pantera. We led the first institutional round in Zcash. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that sub area, which has been largely funded and propelled by cryptos. It's fascinating how a lot of that research really got pushed forwards by the need for scaling.
yeah.
That need for scaling is now turning into privacy. And we're looking at another very interesting company right now. I can't mention yet, but we'll hopefully be closing a deal in that space as well, in the ZK space.
That's really cool. I met with Rob Viglione, who was the founder of Zencash,
Oh
which
yeah,
is around the same time as
yeah, sure.
Zcash, and
Hmm.
this has been so fun because I've spoken with so many, you know, just so many people with diverse backgrounds. But what's been really fun is speaking to like the OGs who can take us back to that time and how it really was and how it felt and at the time it was everything was just so new and so uncertain. um but to see where ZK is now is like it's with projects like Risk Zero and Succinct, and with the Ethereum Foundation talking about ZK proofs recently and potentially uh utilizing ZK proofs on the execution layer. It's like maybe like now is the time for ZK. It's really feeling that way. Whereas before
Yeah,
it felt like a research project, but right now it feels, wow, this thing could actually be really useful to people and to human
yeah,
beings. It's quite
yeah. I think
exciting.
so. I think it's ready for prime time.
I think
Um,
so.
Not everyone agrees with me, but it's I think that's also the moment when there's this moment where there's a gap between what most people understand and what's possible, and
Mhm.
then that usually flips pretty fast. Like they suddenly everyone understands it, um,
Yeah.
and
What's
we're kind of at that point right now.
what's the saying? Like things are really slow and then they go really fast, or something like that. What's the
Yeah.
saying? But it really certainly feels that way with, having been in the privacy space for a while, you and I have too with, Oasis and other
Mm.
projects. It's like it feels like there's like a converging of, it's like now feels like the right time. Um and I'm excited for the intersection of not crypto specifically, but ZK or privacy and
Mhm.
AI. I think there's a clear need there.
Yeah,
Um where
and
where it's
that's an interesting
actually
area actually.
helpful.
That the one we were looking at recently is very much focused around this idea of independent of crypto agents. If you imagine like Model Context Protocol, which is essentially a language written by Anthropic to allow agents to talk to each other, and
Mhm.
imagine an agent from IBM and an agent from Salesforce, and one of them asks the other one a question. It's like, well, so how do you know the integrity of that answer? How do you know what it was built from? How do
Mm.
you know that? So, like, essentially, how do you trust each other? And so, looking at understanding the a certain state of a model and what has changed in that state, and being able to then prove the difference between where you are today and where you are, next. And
Yeah.
so, I think there'll be applications. I'm being a little vague here, but that's essentially like what we're looking at with how to apply ZK to these areas.
That's really cool. That's very cool. Well, Seven, this has been such a fun conversation,
Yeah,
and
thank you, Peter.
thanks for taking us through the AI stack, AI, the history of AI, and very
Mhm.
excited for what you and the team are up to at Nazare. And For any founders that are interested in learning more, go to nazare.io. And in the show notes, I'll share information on Seven, how you can get in touch with him if you're looking for investment in your startup.
Yeah, and like also just encourage people if they want to. I'm actually very approachable if you want to chat about what you're doing and just drop some notes. I'm usually actually pretty easy to get in touch with, so happy to
Awesome.
advise. I mean, not like advice, but just give some help. I'd like to see the space get better, and
That's great.
people. It's hard to get going in these kind of industries sometimes, and sometimes you just need like a helpful hand.
Yeah, and be sure to follow Seven at D7 Troll,
Yeah,
DENTRAL on Twitter.
thanks.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Seven, and best of luck to you and the team, and excited for what you guys are up to.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, cheers.